I'd like to hear more about how reading forwards is perhaps a more productive task. In other words, doing an analysis of Samson that is archaeological in its project, so as to uncover ways in which it serves as a foundation, or as one of the foundations, or as a way in which certain ideas and assumptions that we do have as moderns took earlier shape. And is that less problematic or more problematic as far as you're concerned? It's not the same as number 3, right? It's not the same as reception history, but it's related to that.
It's more number 2, and it's a different project.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. I like all the projects.
Mm-hmm.
I like appropriating things.
Mm-hmm. But it's not literary criticism in your view.
That's right. My view of what literary criticism is extremely narrow.
What seems to me over and over again to be an intensely ambivalent relationship that exists between Samson and the Danites and the people whom he has been sent to liberate. And in some ways, any potential confusion that the reader might have in reading Samson's motives, whether or not he is divinely inspired, whether or not his actions are licensed or somehow prompted by the rousing motions that he feels, that he says he feels, may already be embedded in the poem in the confused understandings that about Samson that are articulated on the one hand by the chorus, which repeatedly sort of tries in one way or another to make sense of what Samson is doing, or on the other hand by Manoah in his conversations with Samson. Samson, in his own discussions, especially in his conversation, the invented conversation with Harifa, speaks about his own frustrations about the people whom he came to liberate and who didn't take him up on that task, who didn't allow him to fulfill that duty, who ignored him or who turned on him in some cases. And if we then expand the context even further into the book of Judges, we see Samson's story as a part of a much larger pattern of internal strife, division within the Israelite community, within the tribes of Israel. Whether it's the stories of Gideon or Deborah and Barak, or most vividly, I think, in the gruesome and horrifying conclusion of the book of Judges, with the civil war and the brutal mutilation and dismemberment of the Levite concubine. The only time the poem offers us what looks to be some kind of an unequivocal or unproblematic acceptance of Samson's actions is after he dies, when the chorus and Manoah celebrate what he has done. And this is, in many ways, makes me think especially of Faisal's comments today about the sort of the silence and the narrative that is then subsequently imposed upon it. But if in the earlier comments that Regina and Suzanne and John as well talk about the way in which othering functions as a means of identifying proper and appropriate targets of violence, is there a way in which this poem engages with that problem, but internally, not just looking outward, but internally as one that exists in the dynamics between Samson and the people whom he is there to free?
It seems to me that you come down to almost an Amsonian position. I'm thinking what Gina was saying in the first commandment, that it's God who gives you the freedom, right? And who sort of endorses or insists on absolutely putting a ban on idolatry, and endorses even, at least as I understand Scripture, genocidal attacks and utter, not just genocide, but everything that they touch, everything, their possessions, just utterly wipe it out. And it's not something that it happens, especially in the book of Judges. Again and again and again, God says, kill all of them and everything that everything they touched. And Milton's going to take that seriously. And I think that in some sense he's got to grapple with that. And if your God gave you freedom, so that you would, and Stanley, in your article, when you talk about this, saying that whatever, just trying to do what God wants you to do, and he likes the story. And I think I don't know that you're right about this, about Abraham and Isaac. Milton has trouble, and he doesn't quote that very much. He does not want to go back to that instance of a proof text in Christian doctrine. He much prefers the miraculous birth story in Abraham's story.
Right.
I think the thing with JL is also, Dalila cites that story and says, I'm just like her. And I think that there's a lot more to that argument than we seem to be willing to concede. That the God that Milton presents orders people to do awful things. And we can't get away from it. And if we're going to talk about the meaning of Samson Agonistes, we have to, how do you teach that meaning without raising the consciousness of your students to the morality or lack of morality of a suicide bomber, which I think, if Faisal said, really convincingly demonstrates that it's not.
If the consciousness of my students are raised in relation to matters not specifically discussed in the class, I have no objection to that. I also have absolutely no interest in that.
But it is part of what you're doing by uncovering the meaning, and I would say necessarily.
Those are contingent. Those are contingent effects. But I certainly agree with your statements preliminary to that question. And in fact, Milton, in Avenge, O Lord, Thy Slaughtered Saints, is saying to God, you haven't done enough killing yet. Here's something else. Here's some other people I'd like you to kill.
Can I ask John a question? It's as you were speaking, you said he's commanded to do, or he wants to do, or needs to do awful things. And when you said awful things, I thought, boy, this really does raise the question of sympathy. That is, are we supposed to sympathize with the Philistines, or are we supposed to think, these are awful people and we have to get rid of them? Are we supposed to think more, I mean, or are we supposed to think both?
From Milton's point of view, and I think Milton is aware of the historical distance between his time and the period of Judges, but I do think that Milton was quite capable of feeling the emotion that Faisal talks about, with the dancing in the streets when your enemies are killed. Mm-hmm. And
So he wouldn't describe it as doing an awful thing. He'd describe it as doing a liberating thing.
He argues.
Like we describe killing Nazis. When we talk about bombing Nazis to liberate people from concentration camps,
right,
we rarely say to each other, we did a terrible thing.
Right.
I think this is an important issue.
There are people who talk about the firebombing of Dresden and say that was a terrible thing.
Oh yeah, that was terrible. But when they talk about, really dropping a bomb on the strategic Nazis who are responsible for concentration camps, they rarely say it was an awful thing. I think that may be the way Milton is asking us to think about people worshiping an idol, because they're worshiping falsehood, and we've got to obliterate them.
Okay,
and
so where does
idolatry
stop? Do you do it to Roman Catholics?
Well, it's really scary.
Do you do it to Trinitarians?
Yeah, it's a terribly terrifying.
Where do you stop killing?
Yeah,
and who's left at the end?
And not only that, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know if they're really wrong?
That's right.
Who's to say that someone's an idolater?
Well, I think that.
But by their fruits. By their fruits, and when you have that strong instinct for freedom, and we can have a long discussion over what that means, but strong instinct toward freedom, an oppressor represents the brutality that is, as I tried to cite, somehow inhuman. So it's deeply tied with the idolatry. The idolatry represents that inhumanity.
Yeah.
Yes, if you were being kept enslaved by someone and you could kill them, I think I would. I mean, I would celebrate doing it. I mean, yeah, I'm free.
Of course, Milton wants you to kill not your enemy, but God's enemy.
Right.
And that's important. And the reference that Regina made to...
Which is you let God kill them for you. I mean, the idea is that the vengeance is God, which is why what Faisal is saying is really compelling, that the notion that you get rid of all the personal motivation, and I'm just the instrument, I'm the divine wind.
And the prayer. And therefore the prayer.
Now, the representation of Nazis in some of our literature, interestingly enough, began to change in the 80s a little bit, with movies like The Eagle Has Landed, an interesting Michael Caine Robert Duvall movie in which you are allowed to feel some kind of sympathy. That went along, and I think that there have been more and more films in which sympathy, not for the devil, but for the Nazis, but not for the Nazis in general, but for particular Nazis, has been allowed, which is what makes the recent movie Defiance so interesting, because it doesn't have a half a second's worth of that. Just kill those Nazis.
What we see, and this relates to other comments here too, is that Milton had a great deal of concern for liberty, but also no concern whatsoever for equality. And that seems deeply paradoxical to us, but not to him, right? So that Milton's notion of liberty not only established a radical difference between a figure like Samson and the Philistines, but also differences between Samson and the other Danites. And that too is a running theme, as Regina touched on. And if you look at his other plans for tragedies, this seems to be their development. You know, the Phineas tragedy has all those around Phineas confused over what it is that he's doing, but at the end, the voice of God justifies what he's done. Abraham tragedy, same thing. Everyone sits around wondering what Abraham's up to, but at the end, the voice of God justifies. And so I think that the status of the liberator, with respect to his nation and with respect to the society whence he arises, is rather different in Milton's thought than we might expect it to be in, say, modern-day liberation theology.
I cited Orlando Patterson, who is a sociologist who's done the history of freedom in Western culture. A lot of people have done it from 1,000 different points of view. But he makes a distinction between what he calls personal freedom, sovereignal freedom, and civic freedom. And sovereignal freedom is the freedom you have relative to somebody else. And so every time somebody has sovereignal freedom, they have it at the expense of somebody else. And Milton is not so far off that version. You know, he believes in God's call to the individual, a call of freedom, for freedom, to freedom, the ability to make your own choices, all that sort of thing. But at the same time, as you say, it's not necessarily equal because God hasn't made that equal in everybody. And he spends, in my view, he spends much of his prose and his poetry trying to sort that out.